Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of BacklogBusters, where every other Monday I'm busting out my gaming backlog one video at a time and letting you know if after all these years, these games are worth playing today. In this episode, we're trying to narrowly avoid a copyright strike by muting possibly the catchiest song licensed for a video game in
SSX Tricky. I hope you're ready.
Why am I playing SSX Tricky today? Well, I've gotten several recommendations to play this game, but anytime I searched local used game stores, I always came back with the wrong version, picking up a plainly named SSX, which apparently is the first game in the series, and Tricky is technically SSX 2, something I never realized, then finding SSX 3 and SSX on tour, but never Tricky. Clearly realizing the struggle I was going through, my partner got me a copy of SSX Tricky over the holidays, and I've been super excited to check it out. Should I have maybe started with the first game, just plain old SSX? Possibly, but whenever I tackle the first game in a series, I know it could be weeks or even months before I get around to the sequel in an effort to give y'all a nice variety of games and not just have a month of SSX or whatever series I'm starting. Plus, Tricky is the one I always hear about, not even knowing that the original SSX existed. Was this the right choice? Would y'all rather see games in order? Let me know in the comments. But for today, let's throw order of release out the window and instead jump right to the one that most people talk about. SSX Tricky was first released for the PlayStation 2 in 2001, on November 5th for the US and on the 30th for Europe. It showed up on the GameCube and Xbox shortly after, in December for the US and July for Europe, later getting a Game Boy Advance port, which seems to be the thing to do for any release in the early 2000s. It was published not by some old fossilized company like
EA Games.
Challenge everything.
or that publisher your grandparents used,
EA Sports. It's in the game.
but instead by the rad new Extreme publisher,
EA Sports.
which was created for SSX. And its last gnarly game published onto store shelves 7 years later with the release of FIFA Street 3, ending the raddest run of game publishing the world ever saw. SSX Tricky was developed by EA Canada, now known as EA Vancouver, who've made a ton of EA Sports games, like NHL, NBA, and FIFA series, as well as most of the EA Sports big series of games, like the NBA, NFL, and FIFA Street games, and almost all of the SSX games through the years as well. Let's talk about the first game for just a second though, as one of the more interesting things about the creation of SSX is that the executive producer and creative leader, Steve Rechtschaffner, was the creator of an Olympic event called Border Cross, which seems to have inspired the SSX series, with Rechtschaffner sticking around for the first 3 games in the series after that. The first SSX was a launch title for the PS2, and according to EA themselves, the first SSX was deemed a commercial failure, but the critics couldn't get enough. And that does seem to be true, as it still sits at a 93 on Metacritic with a must-play badge, and it received a PS2 Game of the Year award from IGN, Electronic Gaming Monthly, GameSpot, and official PlayStation Magazine. Luckily, it was quickly followed by SSX Tricky, only a year later. EA themselves said the game wasn't considered a true sequel since it had a remixed version of the courses from the original, along with 2 new courses. It also added new characters, Uber moves, and a rivalry system, which seems to have sold better overall, gaining platinum status for selling over 800,000 copies and sitting at a 92 on Metacritic this time, with another must-play tag. So with all the praise for SSX Tricky, which I didn't realize some considered more of an expansion pack to the seemingly already good SSX, let's throw our snow gear on and start looking back at this game, starting with the things I liked. SSX has a structure that will be very familiar to anyone who's played a racing or extreme sports game. You'll be going from location to location, trying to earn a gold medal and increasing your starting rank of newbie all the way to master rank. Which really reminds me of the structure of the Tony Hawk games, because every character has a base set of stats, and as you progress you'll be earning more stat points to increase your speed, stability, tricks, and more, unlocking new characters, boards that affect your stats, and outfits that affect nothing. It's super fun to slowly build up your character through the different events until you've crafted the world's most perfect snowboarder. And since you can progress to the next stage as long as you get a bronze medal, you can head back to the older levels with your newly maxed out character and just rake in the gold medals. Like a reunion tour through all your past mistakes, which, if you're anything like me, there will be a lot of. And there's a ton to do if you're a completionist, as you start with 4 characters and can unlock a total of 12. all of which need to be leveled up individually by getting gold across a total of 8 different courses in both the race and show-off, being the trick and high score event. The courses are largely the same between the two events, but there are some added rails, ramps, and multipliers when competing in the show-off event. My first recommendation would be to put most, if not all, of your stat points into tricks, as they're the main way you're going to fill your boost meter, and since half of the events in the world circuit revolve around achieving a high score, it's very helpful. Also, my other recommendation is to maybe not worry about getting gold on your first try, and let your stats increase a bit, unlock new boards, and then come back to an earlier course if you need a little advantage, or if the benefit of playing more courses will improve your actual skills at the game so you aren't bumping into as much stuff and missing trick opportunities and shortcuts. That progression is great and all, but what's actually making you come back race after race to play this game? Well, it's just a blast to play. Excuse me while I mention Tony Hawk again, because that's my point of reference when coming into this game. The thing I loved and sometimes hated about Tony Hawk was trying to nail a trick, when going for a high score and just completely failing a combo and restarting quickly, or getting so close and just missing the score to beat by a tiny margin. Then the wave of excitement when you finally beat the 6th score in a level. Those are the exact same feelings I get when playing SSX Tricky, and it's great. But this plays pretty differently because you are on a slope and you're traveling downhill. Duh. And you'll need to get tricks off as you go, which increases your boost, which lets you go faster in races or leap off ramps with more air in the show-off events. But in both events, you need to make it to the finish line at the bottom, so even if there were circular bowls in here like Tony Hawk, you can't just grind endlessly for millions of points because you'll run out of time. Even when you find half pipes, you can't just hang out here, so get a few tricks in with no trees around and then just move on. Which gives everything in here a certain panicked feel. Not sure if that's the right word, but you will feel pressure from the timer and the other racers to keep your speed up while also nailing tricks, gaining boost, and finishing the race in time. And the way that tricks work is also different than I expected, as when you're airborne, you can press one of the L, R, or Y buttons to grab your board, which counts as a trick. Pressing multiple buttons at once will do some more complicated grabs. Then you can also press B or X as well to tweak the current grab, which turns it into a slightly different trick. The amount of buttons you've got to press and hold at the same time after also pressing and holding other buttons gets a little overwhelming, but how do you expect to pull off sinful, unethical, or madness tricks without a few finger cramps? But please do be careful, because you do not want to accidentally tweak your grab when you have a full boost meter, or you'll trigger an uber trick, which are undeniably the coolest and best way to increase your score, but they are lengthy trick animations and you need a lot of air to pull them off and not crash, so you want to be very deliberate when you trigger these. Every character has a set of these uber tricks that they can pull off, with a few having completely unique signature variations, and these are super fun, but again, they take forever to pull off, so you'll need a big ramp and a full boost meter. Finally nailing these uber tricks and seeing their gravity-defying animations gives this game just a level of excitement that I've not seen in a sports game like this before. There are some other odd things about the controls though, as by default you'll use the D-pad to spin or flip, and you'll use the D-pad to spin on a rail. So you'll be reaching from the control stick to the D-pad and back quite often while speeding downhill, as well as holding 3+ buttons at a given time for any trick. I slowly got used to all this, but for me, the one downside with the trick system in this game is that your fingers can be a bit of a jumbled mess. So a few times I did wistfully think of Tony Hawk and it's one button for flip tricks and one button for grab tricks. There's also a trick book for each character that has 6 chapters listing 5 tricks each, with new chapters unlocking as you complete each selected trick. Weirdly, the button combinations to pull off the tricks aren't listed here. They're kind of kept secret until you're on the slopes, at which point you can see the button combo if you open the pause menu, which seemed kind of odd to me that the controls were hidden in one area and shown in the other. But luckily there is a mode to help you practice tricks and see the button combinations in action, which is extremely helpful. Once you get used to this trick system that admittedly, as I talk through it, sounds like a lot, it does feel really good to play, and it's the thing that kept me coming back day after day trying to get gold on all of these courses after dozens of restarts and bronze medals. Even if this game does twist my fingers into a knot sometimes, pulling off the tricks is exciting, landing huge combos and coming out on top is just as satisfying as any Tony Hawk game I've played, which is high praise because that's one of my favorite series. SSX Tricky also has a ton of wild characters, a great soundtrack, Run DMC playing every time you land a halfway decent trick, colorful courses, and the best tricks in a sports game. Every character in the game also has a lengthy backstory, a whole Q&A session weirdly, and is fully voiced, with your character making comments to others in the race and show-off events, making little jabs or trash talking as they pass or get past on the slopes. It's more playful than probably happens in a real competition, but it's just fun and it makes everyone here feel like real characters with history and less of just a set of stats on a bunch of character models. There was one feature I never would have seen coming that just blew me away, because this game seemingly has a precursor to something like the Nemesis system some of you might have seen in Shadow of Mordor, in that the game tracks your rivalries with other characters. So if you push someone going down the slopes or bump into them, at the end of the race you'll get a listing of how they feel about you, and it changes the aggressiveness of that character throughout the World Circuit mode. If the aggression rises, they'll seek you out on the slopes to bump and shove you around. You also might get a cutscene at the finish line of them confronting you.
The gloves are off, chump.
And even before the race, they might call you out as well. On the flip side, if you're neutral or friendly with the others, you'll get friendly callouts before races.
Airtime, baby!
Absolutely!
And normally in racing games, I like to race clean and not bump into other cars, so I was doing the same here and only stumbled onto the system when I accidentally ran into another racer. But I later found out that flicking the right stick can shove a character, which I wasn't going to use, but if you manage to knock them over, you gain a full boost meter, which is very helpful in a game all about gaining boost. But you'll have to consider if it's worth having an aggressive enemy throughout the game to gain that meter. There's no reason that this system should be in here, because there's more than enough here for a fun game, that it didn't need a whole Walking Dead-esque, Eddie will remember this, friendliness tracker. But it's a really cool wrinkle that makes the characters much more memorable, and it makes you consider your actions in a snowboarding game. It's just something I never would have expected to show up in this game, and it's a really cool idea that I don't think was continued in any of the other sequels as far as I can tell, which is a shame because I think this captures the idea of a competition better than any other games with this structure. Through the World Circuit mode, you'll travel across America, Canada, France, and Japan, where the courses will vary between normal-looking slopes to ruined cities covered in snowdrifts and a snowboarding amusement park that's filled with wind turbines, loose glass, and I just can't imagine this death trap being included in the World Circuit next season with this many code violations. Even on the simpler-looking and more natural courses, you'll be greeted by sharp turns, huge jumps, and grind rails snaking through the sky. And all the levels are just playgrounds for snowboarding. And it's in no way a simulator going for realism, but instead just looking to maximize fun. And a big part of what makes these courses so appealing is that they're filled with alternate routes and shortcuts. Some of them are marked by SSX signs that you can bust through. Others are more hidden, requiring you to find a secret entrance or grind a certain rail, or even just be able to clear a specific large gap. There are so many different ways to get around these levels, and finding the most efficient route for races or the best route for big jumps and tricks and show-off events will go a long way to ensuring you earn the gold medal. Multiplayer sits in an odd middle ground for me because I've mainly heard of SSX Tricky because of people's fond memories of playing multiplayer, but I just found it kind of lacking. Don't get me wrong, it's a fun two-player competitive mode where you can face off in the race and show-off events with a new time challenge event exclusive to the single event mode that lets you play with 1 or 2 players. If you and a sibling, friend, or partner have both been playing through the World Circuit mode on your own and understand how to play and be competitive, then it's a fun time. But it doesn't seem like a game that would be much fun if you're just hopping in. And again, the controls are kind of complicated and a lot to explain as you're loading into a match. Plus, if one player has experience with this game, they will dominate the 2-player mode. So it seems best suited for 2 players that are on the exact same experience level with this game, otherwise it's going to be a very one-sided event. I also found it odd that you choose from your characters and their current stats, so if you've leveled up only one character, then it's very unfair of you to pit them against a completely stock character that your player 2 may pick. Sure, you could make it fair by handing the leveled up character to the less experienced player, but is a super maxed out character going to be too much for them to handle? Or could you both choose a completely stock character unless you've leveled up every single one? Just based on the wild tricks, characters, and bright colors of this game, from a glance, I could see someone, including myself, assuming it might be fine for anyone to hop into, but I'm not sure that this is the game for that. But let's say both players are very experienced with SSX Tricky and hop in to test their skills against each other. That's fine. But the game came out before widescreen TVs were common, so both players have an extremely narrow view, which makes it very hard to see what's coming around a turn, or even understand where you are and what's happening in some points. Playing multiplayer towards the end of my time with the game just felt a little disorienting, with the narrow view that I wasn't used to, and I struggled a bit to think of what competitive or party situation this would work super well in. It's not bad by any stretch. It's a multiplayer game and an already fun game, which I'll always say yes to, but it just has some caveats that bring down the fun that I feel like this game could have been. Now to move on to some things that I disliked, starting with the repetition. If you're a completionist or someone looking for a ton of stuff to unlock and do, you'll probably love this. But since you level up each character separately and there are no changes to the courses from character to character, you'll be replaying the same levels over and over with slightly different stats at least 12 times if you want to see everything this game has to offer. Which, from what I can tell, is mostly skins, boards, and 2 extra courses that you can't even play in the world circuit mode for some reason. If you're like me, then you'll kind of be done after completing the courses with 1, maybe 2 characters, so it's not going to take you super long. Sure, you've got a ton of characters and courses for multiplayer now, but if you're coming at this solo, the world circuit mode was a little bit disappointing, just because there's not much difference on the subsequent playthroughs, besides the other characters having slightly different starting stats and trick commands to learn. And let's say you kept your stats pretty even, so you excel at nothing, and wonder if you crafted a bad character. Well, you can't refund any of those points, and you can't really try another character as you'll need to start from scratch and play through all the beginning courses again, which made me very hesitant to try other characters until I came to just a complete standstill with some trick events as Eddie, and just started over with a completely different character, who turned out to be way easier to pull off tricks with, especially after I dumped all the stat points into tricks. And even if you don't swap characters, you'll already be playing through these courses a lot, as every single race event is made up of 3 rounds, quarter, semi, and final, with you needing to place first in each round to nab the gold, which is very common in most sports games, and honestly, I've never liked this. The one cherry on top is that after crossing the finish line in any position, first or lower, you can restart the current round you're on, which helps a lot, especially when going for gold. But even if I nailed 1 round of the course, I had 2 other times to play it minimum, and most of the time I needed to restart multiple rounds of a given course to make sure that I got first in all of them and collected that gold medal, which is just in such sharp contrast to the trick mode, where it's just 1 single round, so it's really easy and painless to mess up and restart, not having to nail 3 perfect runs in a row. Plus, the game doesn't list what round of the race you're currently in anywhere on the screen until you reach the finish line. So sometimes I'd lose track after so many restarts, and it was just kind of a repetitive, confusing mess on some of the later courses that are really challenging and required a lot of attempts. My biggest issue with this game is that it doesn't do a good job of teaching you what's gonna hurt you and what doesn't hurt you, something that I'm still not very clear on. Sometimes a billboard that's perfectly lined up with a ramp in front of it can be smashed through. Other times it has light bulbs and you crash right into it. Occasionally there will be these harmless looking inflatable yellow arrows that you can smash right through to find a shortcut or alternate route. But try it another time or on another course and they'll knock you into the snow. A whole race could be ruined by one tiny little light on the ground that throws you so off course that you end up in a ravine. I just honestly couldn't ever tell what was going to break apart or brush aside and reveal a secret path, or what would absolutely just destroy my racer and lose me a ton of time. All of this made me question if the game was just slightly buggy, glitchy, or had some issues that I was unaware of when playing this game 22 years later. But through trial and error, plus avoiding most things, I could get past this. But grinding on rails is an integral part of this game, and they gave me so much trouble because for the life of me, I could not figure out how to consistently get onto a rail in this game. Do you keep your board pointed forward and go straight into the rail? Because it works sometimes. Other times I collide with the rail, get bounced up into the air, and either crash, fall into a pit, or any other number of things that mean I'm losing this event. Or is pointing your board forward the wrong move? Maybe you turn the board so the middle portion is on the rail. Okay, surely that's it, right? It seems like this has a tiny % higher chance of not colliding with the rail and getting bounced into oblivion, but it's not a 0% chance, that's for sure. Okay. It must be that you're always supposed to hop onto the rail, you never try to ride into it, even though most rails taper into the ground in a way that would make you think that this is possible. I must have missed a comment on this or a tutorial message or something in the instruction manual. Well, snowboards are narrower than I thought, and it's really hard to hop at the right height to land on these when pointing your board downhill. So again, I tried turning my board, but if you're jumping and turn your board, that's now a spin. And who knows if you'll be in a position to land sideways on a rail or end up spinning all the way around and just completely missing it. Throughout the entire game, I struggled with knowing what objects were dangerous, but even ones that were confirmed safe by previous runs would still hurt me sometimes. And it was the exact same thing with rails. Some were fine, even one restart earlier, but then would just bounce me off the next time. And please, if I'm missing some key thing, let me know in the comments, because every time I think I've figured out how to properly deal with objects or rails, I just get proven wrong a few runs later. And it really negatively affected an otherwise great feeling game for me. At first I was fine moving past the inconsistent tells for which items were dangerous, as early on there isn't that much stuff around and the courses are a little more sparse and open like natural ski slopes. But as the game goes on, the courses become narrower and more cluttered with just stuff everywhere. Some of the later levels were just a pain for me to navigate, with so many narrow passageways, dangerous ramps, icy terrain, obstacles, and more that just felt a little suffocating compared to the start of the game. And sure, I've only played this game for probably 15 hours at this point, and if I spent more time memorizing these levels or was just better at the game overall, it might not be that much of a problem. But let's consider this level, Tokyo Megaplex, that's got a real pinball vibe to it and features a network of floating pipes, which are good for racing, but not really great for tricks. I'll have good enough speed to get some air and pull off a great trick going off a ramp one time. The next time, whoops, I jumped a little too high or with maybe a little bit different angle and just end up in a tube in the sky, which is not what I wanted. Other times I'm luckier and I accidentally land on a rail, which gives me a good combo, but it just felt so inconsistent and random, like I'd lost control. All of this extra clutter and some strange layouts made me wonder if this stuff was placed just to mess with you, honestly. Like this weird channel along the side of the course with no way to exit it, and if you end up here, you should just hit the reset to track button immediately, or might as well completely restart the level if you're aiming for gold. Why even add this section? Even if you keep it, why not reset the player the second they land here? Some areas looked like shortcuts with a ramp seemingly pointed in the same direction that instead launched me out of bounds. Other areas had just odd geometry layouts where your character can easily get stuck in a nook right after being shot off a ramp on the main path, or force your character to get weirdly turned around. Even if I ignore any physics glitches or bugs, even some odd ramp, rail, or obstacle placement, the last few courses are just full of pitfalls that have rails that you have to grind unless you want to fall out of bounds, ramps that need a ton of speed and the right jump timing to cross a huge chasm, and much more like this. Several times through my first and second playthrough, I wished I could have lowered my character's stats and turned their speed way down, because some ramps, rails, and gaps felt like they were almost measured out for certain speed of characters and felt broken if you're using too fast of a character or accidentally boosting over a ramp, because they will send you straight into an object, smashing into the roof, thrown off the stage, or just dumped into a ravine. For the majority of the courses, especially the early ones, I felt that they were very thoughtfully laid out with a main path and then optional high-risk areas that worked as shortcuts or high-score opportunities. But as the game went on, I felt like some of this design was lost, and instead you end up being thrown into just a gauntlet without as much choice or flexibility, and seemingly some odd physics bugs on top of that. Now, with all that in mind, how do I feel about this game overall, and would I recommend SSX Tricky as a game that should be on your backlog? This one's really a maybe that's teetering on the edge of yes. I love the World Circuit mode. That's just classic 2000s extreme sports game, upgrading your character and gear to take on harder challenges. It's got a great looking and feeling trick system that will have you taking just one more try late into the night, and I thought the rival system was super unique, brought these characters to life, and made it feel more like an actual competition. Plus, it all takes place on fun levels with so many optional hidden paths that you need to piece together to form the perfect route for the most speed or the most tricks. And most of what makes the game good can be experienced in multiplayer, but I just feel like it could have been so much more. But because of the challenge these levels pose and the lack of variation between each rider's campaign, it can start to feel repetitive, though there are dozens of hours worth of content here for completionists. I also felt like the levels were a little too cramped, cluttered, and lost some of the choice and flexibility that the early levels gave you once the optional high-risk areas just became every portion of the levels. And my biggest issue was with the inconsistent collisions with objects and rails, which when I say it out loud sounds so small and nitpicky, but I ran into issues with this so frequently that it just really wore on me, and ultimately brought down a game I would have wholeheartedly recommended to something I'm more on the fence about. And please, tell me and let me know if I'm just doing something wrong or missed something that would ease the issues I had. And I'll throw out my normal message that my opinions on this game are not meant to tarnish any fond memories you have of playing this. And if you loved or still love this game, please tell me why in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your experience and talk more about the parts that I also really liked. Now, if you're interested in playing this game, sadly, there are no modern options. You have the original PS2, Xbox, and GameCube versions, which aren't too expensive but are rising in price as with all older classic games. If you've got an Xbox One or Xbox Series console, you can play the reboot of SSX that's backwards compatible. It does get rid of a lot of the style from Tricky, but I played actually a ton of this game at time of release, and I had a blast with it, especially competing in the time trial modes with friends online. But after playing SSX Tricky, the reboot does feel drastically different. Not in a bad way, but just not what fans of Tricky are probably expecting or maybe looking for, but I do think it's worth a try. Also on the Xbox One and Xbox Series consoles, you can get a backwards compatible version of SSX 3, which has been upscaled to 4K and plays incredibly well. It's a more open game and seems to lose some of the style of Tricky in favor of a more natural mountain. But I had a really good time so far, and I want to play more of SSX 3 for sure. But that's it for this episode of BacklogBusters. Have you played SSX Tricky? What did you think? Is it a must-play game that deserves to be on others' backlogs? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to talk more about this game. Also, let me know if you have suggestions for a game that I should clear off my backlog next, and I'll work to make a video about it. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button, and if you'd like to see more, tap the subscribe button, and if you want to get alerted the second my video comes out, hit the bell icon. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and see you in the next video.